It's just after noon Central Time, which means it's my privilege to welcome you to today's Mind Your Career webinar, Prepping for Success in the Interview, presented by A-J Aronstein. For those who aren't familiar with our work, Alumni Career Programs is committed to helping provide alumni with the resources they need to stay competitive in our ever-changing job market and support the alumni community with career resources, networking channels, and job search capabilities. Today's webinar, like all of them this week, is co-hosted by UChicagoGRAD, an office committed to serving the graduate and postdoc community, focusing on recruitment, skills and experience, career development, and alumni engagement. Today's webinar is presented by UChicago alumnus A-J Aronstein. A-J is a 2010 graduate of the Master's of Arts program in the Humanities and is currently the Director of Graduate Career Development and Employer Relations at UChicagoGRAD. Today's presentation will teach you to plan, prepare, and practice in order to perform your best in your next interview. This will review some of the most common interview questions to expect, techniques for structuring your answers, and tips for feeling confident walking in. AJ will also leave time to answer your questions at the end of today's presentation. So let's get to the reason we're all here today, and let me welcome AJ.
Thanks, Allie. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be back here on Wednesday of this week of what we call March term here at UChicagoGRAD. Again, my name is A-J Aronstein, and I'm the Director of Graduate Career Development and Employer Relations here. Our office is an integrated one-stop shop, a kind of supermarket for graduate students and postdocs here at UChicago when it comes to career development, fellowship applications, writing advising, and things like oral communications consulting, which is a great resource for those of you who are current students, postdocs, or alums 5 years out. You can actually take advantage of our advisors who are called Grad Talk consultants, and they do everything from helping individuals prep for informational interviews to phone interviews, Skype. They'll help you rehearse for just about any kind of interview that you have coming up, so we hope that some of you will take advantage of that resource. Our topic today is, of course, acing interviews, and I thought that I would just start off by explaining the image. As you know, a couple of us here at the office are a little obsessed with 80s movies, so our theme today is Indiana Jones. We've got some fun stuff coming up through the rest of the week. I love this little GIF. GIFs are awesome, kind of generally, but I love this Indiana Jones thing because I think it suggests to me something that we see a lot among candidates who are getting ready for interviews. So you feel close, you feel like you've almost gotten the job, and all you got to do is take the idol off of that little platform there, and then you should be good to go. The problem is that a lot of the folks that we advise here at UChicagoGRAD think that once they're through, once they've run the gauntlet of the resume and cover letter review, once they've found their way through the vortex of human resources, that they're pretty much good and set to go. I want to talk today about why it's important to prep for interviews no matter what career stage you're at, and I'm going to talk about interviews as a skill, as something that really rewards practice and continued engagement no matter where you're at. To recap where we've been so far, on Monday we talked a little bit about career exploration. Career exploration is an ongoing process for professionals at every stage of their career, and the difference between jobs and careers, the difference between career exploration and a job search. Yesterday, for those of you who joined us, we had the fabulous Joe Chai talk about job documents, best practices for resumes and cover letters. We like to think about job documents as at UChicagoGRAD as your ticket to an interview. We like to say here, no one has ever been offered a job just based on how fabulous the fonts look on your resume. So resumes are really just your ticket to entry for more conversations with the firm or organization where you are hoping to get a job. Today we'll talk about interviewing, and I'll go into how the talk breaks down in just a moment. Tomorrow we will have Mike Tessel, who's our Associate Director here at UChicagoGRAD in charge of science advising for PhDs. He'll talk about networking, and specifically using the UChicago Alumni Network to your advantage as you conduct a job search. And we'll round out with Emily Easton, who is Associate Dean of Students in the Physical Sciences Division, who will talk about best practices with respect to negotiation. So on to today's topic, which is interviewing. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, I will walk through a couple of these topics today, and we got a lot of questions beforehand. I'll do the best I can to address some of those and keep an eye on the questions as they come in to the side. So please keep them coming, and if I can't get to your question, please don't hesitate at all to email me at aj@uchicago.edu. I'm going to start the talk by running through 5 things to know. If you have to hop off, if you get hungry, if you get bored, if you need to get lunch, if you need to stop off for a cigarette or something, or you just need to go to a meeting, I want you to at least leave with these 5 quick things that we've basically learned over the course of advising more than 1,000 students and postdocs, as well as alumni over the past 2 years here at UChicagoGRAD. I'll move into preparation. And it's really our perspective here that more than half the battle when it comes to an interview is adequate preparation. And I think that we're not used to thinking about preparation as part of the interview itself, but if you can get all of the planning out of the way, you're going to walk into the interview room feeling more comfortable and ready to address potential questions. Then I'll get into what is potentially the heart of the matter for most of you who are on today. I'll talk about what goes on in the room. And by that I mean how you craft effective responses, how you think about articulating the experience that you have, how you think about articulating the skills that maybe you don't quite have enough of or you're worried that you might not have enough of, and make the interviewer still identify you as a good candidate, as a candidate who will fit in the organization. And then we'll close out with follow-up and next steps, which is one of the, I think, most important aspects of the interview process. And something as simple as a thank you note goes a very long way, but it's not something that we're used to thinking too much about with any kind of intention. So first, what are these 5 things to know? Well, one of them I've already kind of hinted at. There's this idea out there, especially among UChicago trainees, that as long as I get to the interview, then I'm really set. As long as I make it through the axe grinder of the HR system that's going to spit my resume out somewhere, I should be totally fine. But the very first thing, I've said it already and I'll say it again throughout the presentation, is that interviewing is a skill that takes practice to be mastered. It really rewards the kind of practice that you can do on your own, but especially with a friend, someone who might not be an expert in your own professional or academic field, who can feed you questions and make sure that you're articulating answers in a way that's understandable. And I think that this practice can help you avoid a very common pitfall, which is that you get all the way to the interview, you feel great, you've taken the idol off the stand, if you'll forgive this egregiously extended metaphor, and then you turn around and realize that you're being chased by a boulder, the boulder here being the unexpected interview question or being blindsided by a topic that you hadn't adequately prepped for. The second kind of key insight is that interviews come in many shapes and sizes, and these many shapes and sizes continue to proliferate, especially on the technological front. Interviews generally can be broken down into these 6 groups. Phone screens, usually conducted with a human resources professional at a large institution, but sometimes by the hiring manager in the very first round after your resume and cover letter have been reviewed and passed along. The next 2, virtual interviews and recorded interviews, I'll talk a little bit more about because I think they've become extremely important in the job search. We're seeing a lot more interviews being conducted by Skype these days. These are sometimes first-round interviews. For academic positions, for those of you who might be doctoral students thinking about academic work, Skype has become probably more than half of the advising that we do for first rounds of interviews for academic jobs. And of course, we're seeing Skype being used in a wide range of industries. A relatively new format that we're seeing here at UChicagoGRAD is the recorded interview, where essentially you're given a set of questions beforehand and then given a time slot during which you can record a 3 to 10-minute video of your responses to these questions. We're seeing a lot more of this, and I thought that I would just raise it as something that you shouldn't be surprised to see if you're interviewing, especially at the lower and entry level terrain, but I imagine that a lot of these uses of technology will start to propagate at higher and higher level hiring. Group interviews are extremely popular among some industries, especially consulting and financial services. These are a great opportunity for you to showcase the fact that you're a facilitator, and we think that some of the best things that you can do in a group interview context is to show that you're as good a listener as you are a talker. and that your ability to interact with other people in the interview is a good model or a good representation of how you'll interact in the actual office space. The final two are the most common that we advise folks on in general. Fit or behavioral interviews are the most common, and they're what we're typically used to thinking of as job interviews. This is where you're communicating your fitness to a particular position, articulating your skills, your experience, and learning a little bit more about the firm in the process. The final is the case, test, or problem interview. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this today. We have other resources on our website at grad.uchicago.edu that you can check out. But essentially, these are interviews that test your ability to walk through a problem, test your ability to articulate solutions to a problem that might mirror those that you will be called upon to solve in a particular role. There's also the minecart obstacle course. We're not going to talk about this one today at all, but if any of you are worried about like an obstacle course or like maybe like navigating a minecart through a temple or something, just email me afterwards. We could talk about that then. Anyway, so the third thing is that interviews should be conversations, not interrogations. It's our assumption that interviews proceed in something like follows. The interviewer asks all of the questions and we're on the spot against the wall, challenged to respond to everything as best we can. This is an extremely stressful way to approach what an interview is, and one of the things I want to suggest to you today is that interviews are more natural and more effective when they feel more like conversations. You should feel empowered to ask questions of the interviewer. You should feel empowered to call back to previous answers. This is especially effective when you feel like you haven't answered something adequately. You can go back and say, I want to clarify my previous position with respect to this question, and move the conversation forward. So you're essentially calling back to a previous answer and then using the current question to keep the conversation moving forward. It's not just you that is on trial here, of course. Part of your task as an interviewee is to evaluate whether you are actually interested in working with the kind of people that you're being interviewed by. This helps empower our interview candidates, we find, especially when folks are super nervous about big interviews. Remember that it's not just you being interviewed. You are also interviewing the firm or organization's staff and trying to see if you are a good fit for the role. In other words, these things are not supposed to be torture, and I think when they're done especially well, when you walk out feeling especially good about an interview, it feels like you had a conversation with someone you want to talk to more. And ideally, a first-round interview, the same way job documents are not key to a job, an interview is not necessarily key to a job either. It's often just your ticket to another conversation. So if you leave an interview feeling like you have more to say, and you might have the opportunity to do that, that's typically a good thing. If an interview feels awful, if you feel really beat up by an interviewer, and you've done everything that you can to prepare, it's a pretty good sign that you might not be a great fit for the organization if you don't like the way that they engage with their job candidates. Number 4, I've alluded to this already, and I think it's important enough to make it one of these 5 points, but virtual interviews are playing an increasing role in hiring across all sectors. Virtual interviews constituted about 10%, or rather, virtual interviews were some part of a job search in 10% of postings in 2010, 42% in 2012, and 60% in 2013. And I can tell you from experience that we're seeing this. This is not a trend that is going to be reversed. So I wanted to lay down a few Skype tips in particular for those of you who are silently panicking at your desks right now, wondering how you're going to navigate through this. Skype is a very special kind of interview scenario, and here I'm using Skype as a proxy for other virtual interview platforms like Google Hangouts, other forms of chat. There are a couple of quick best practices that I'll run through really quickly just so we make sure to put an underline on it. Skype requires a different kind of prep, or rather an additional level of prep than regular interviews. So let's take your average Skype setup. Let's assume that you're going to be on your MacBook Pro talking with somebody who's far away from you. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you are plugged into a wired connection and that you're addressing any technical difficulties, and they almost always come up prior to starting. It's best to choose a location that feels comfortable, but that's not necessarily your apartment, your house, your mom's basement, wherever you're interviewing. And we do recommend, and I'll talk about attire in a little bit, we recommend that you actually dress up for the occasion. So no newscaster, no Ron Burgundy wearing a blazer up top but wearing sweatpants just because they can't see you from the waist down. The thing is, if you're dressed ready to go for a real interview, you're going to be more professional in your responses. The second thing you should do, there's a little stack of books here. It's great to adjust the camera angle so that it's coming down on your face, that you are also front lit. So you want to make sure that there's no glaring backlight. You want to make sure that there's a nice soft light in front of you. And for those of you who might be chuckling or rolling your eyes at this point, this is extremely important. Your appearance in a Skype interview is, if anything, probably more important than in an in-person interview where your gestures, tone, posture, you can have more control over them. Here, technology is mediating everything, and it's very important that you set the scene appropriately. That means that you should probably lock your cat up. If you have a little feline in your apartment, they will always jump on your keyboard in the middle of the interview if they're not safely cloistered away. And also, I really suggest that you turn your phone off or keep it on silent, because your mom, and I don't know about you, but my mom talks in Comic Sans font. Your mom will definitely call you in the middle of the interview, or someone will call you to ask how things are going. And surely you never get cell phone calls in the middle of the day, but trust me, it's going to happen at the least opportune moment. But I also recommend that you have a phone nearby just in case you need to call the interviewer to make sure that technical difficulties get worked through. We have a whole presentation on Skype interviews, and I'm not going to go too much more deeply into Skype right now, other than to say that it's important. People always ask us, where should you look? And I'm going to make this arrow blink. You should stare directly into the camera. You can also move your own image up to the top of the screen so that you can kind of do a quick check to see how your facial expressions are working or not. But if you look directly into the camera, then it will be as though you are looking directly into the interviewer's eyes. And that's where you want to be looking generally. A word on backgrounds for Skype interviews, and these are important too. So everyone always says just find a bookcase, this like ponderous shelf of books in Indy's library seems like a pretty good example. Finding a bookcase is fine, but you want to keep things simple and not bland. So don't ever interview in a white-walled room where it kind of looks like you're in a sterile environment. You don't want to distract the viewer. A flower or vase off to the side, or just a bookshelf with some different kinds of orientations of books tends to be good. You can have posters on a blank wall for sure. What you should definitely avoid is the 3 B's: busy, blank, or bright. Anything that's going to make the image look a little washed out. I'm happy to answer more questions about this if they are out there. So point number 5 is divided into 2 parts. 5A is based on social science research. 80% of what an interviewer thinks of you is determined in the first 20 seconds of their interaction with you. And this 5B here this is a good thing. I think that means that you have all of the control you need in those first 20 seconds. If you can manage the very first impression, then that takes a lot of the pressure off of the rest of the conversation. And it's helpful to do things like practice your handshake, practice the way that you walk into a room wearing the suit that you're going to walk into the room wearing, have only the accessories around you that you're going to have in the interview room, and manage the way that you make a first impression with an interviewer. Okay, so let's move on to prepping. And as I've said, prepping is one of the most important aspects for actually thinking about interviews. I want to talk about prepping from 2 different perspectives. One is in the weeks before, and the other is 24 hours before. The first thing you want to make sure you're doing is your homework. In advance of an interview, you should be combing the firm or organization's website for insights on what they do, who they serve, what their mission is, what kinds of clients or what kind of users do they cater to. It's great to know a little bit about when they've been in the news lately, how they've been in the news, what the most important issues that they're engaged on, what might be evolving with those issues. You want to walk in knowledgeable about a firm or organization, especially if I talked about this in a presentation yesterday. Let's say someone asks you, what you think about a current issue that company X is really engaged in, you want to have a perspective, or you want to be able to understand what their position is on that issue before you go into it. You also kind of want to know what's going on in the world the morning of. I'll talk about that in a second. The next two, I would say start by recording yourself. Start recording your answers to questions, to some of the common questions that I'll talk about, and listen to yourself. You'll see and you'll find that you always will be talking too fast at first. This happens when we deliver presentations, especially webinars as well. But without an audience, it is really easy to speed up. And when you're nervous in front of an interviewer or on the phone, you will definitely be speeding up. So always slow down. You'll hear yourself moving very quickly when you actually listen to your own voice. It also helps to record yourself or to stand in front of a mirror so you can see the way that your gestures amplify or kind of hamper what you're saying. I want you to practice with at least one other person, and preferably in one-on-one situations with multiple people, unless you know that there's going to be a situation in which you're asked to interview with 3 or more people. And you should tell your practice interviewer what kinds of interview scenarios are most intimidating to you, what kinds of questions you're most worried about getting, and run through those. I like to tell practice interviewers to look disengaged or distracted, or I like to ask them to look at their phone while they're running through practice questions. The point here is, if that happens in a live setting, you want to have rehearsed the most difficult situations possible so that you feel comfortable. Almost no one will be so distracted that they'll be looking at their phones. It does happen, but you shouldn't worry about that too much. The fact is, you want to make sure that you are able to stay engaging and fluent even when your interviewer looks distracted. I think this is incredibly important. You should develop good questions. I'll come back to this towards the end. This is an often overlooked aspect of the interview. Your capacity to ask good, thorough questions about a firm or organization says a lot about the homework that you have already done. It also can be another way for you to talk about your own experience. The most common questions that we see or that we like to run through with candidates are your strengths, your weaknesses, your elevator pitch, which will be your 30-second to 1 minute introduction of your work, your previous career, and hopefully why you're excited about the position that's that's currently in front of you. You want to have a good answer to the question of why us. So firms are not necessarily as interested in hearing your long list of qualifications and achievements. They want to hear about your qualifications and achievements expressed in a way that demonstrates that you understand what they want and who they are. So let's say that you don't have a perfectly matched skill set to a particular job description or to an organization, but your ability to talk about what you do have in the context of what they do can be a real asset in the interview room. You should also know what's off limits. I'll talk about some questions that you're not required to answer a little bit farther down, but you should have a sense of what questions are really illegal and are not something that you need to worry about answering. Instead, you need to think about tactics for responding in case they are asked. 24 hours before, if your interview is somewhere other than your hometown, suggest that you get there early, especially for those of you who hang out here in Chicago most of the time. I've seen interview candidates who plan to fly out the morning of an afternoon interview, and thunderstorms or usually snowstorms hamper travel, so it's always good to try to arrive in town 24 hours before. Be sure to reread the job description. You shouldn't leave that aside after you've applied for the job and after your resume and cover letter have been reviewed and passed along. You want to make sure that you're still crisp and in your understanding of what the job is calling for. You should sleep your normal sleep patterns, but make sure that if you're a coffee drinker in the morning, you should caffeinate as usual. So don't change your behaviors too much when it comes to getting to bed early or late, or if I find a lot of students are worried that they're going to be jittery if they have coffee, but sometimes if you break your routine, you're actually going to be setting yourself back. Your body won't be used to a suddenly new set of circumstances. We suggest that you arrive 5 to 10 minutes early and just make sure that you feel comfortable. It's possible that your interview will start late, but you will always feel better aiming for being in the interview space 5 to 10 minutes early. Don't get there 20 minutes early. You don't want to be kind of hanging out. People have jobs and they have a lot else to do, and it's important that you respect that and arrive a little bit early, but not too much. That Goldilocks zone between 5 and 10 minutes early is totally appropriate. Really recommend that you read something unrelated to the job in the morning of an interview. So this helps get your brain going, but also distracts you from the interview itself. Read the Times, read the Wall Street Journal, read something totally ridiculous online, even just watch some videos. Get your brain moving, maybe write something, but make sure that you give your brain the chance to focus on something else. When you come back to your own interview questions, we get a lot of people who will type out long responses and they'll just be studying these things right up to the moment of the interview, and that's not as productive as giving yourself the space. So definitely bring resumes. You don't have to print them out on 50-pound resume paper. Regular paper is totally acceptable. These last are in our acronym RELAX. Make sure you do relax. Bring extra mints and water, so something sweet, something to freshen up, and make sure that you have your own libation, preferably in a nice little water bottle. Bring a light bag. Don't by any means. We get a lot of graduate students and postdocs especially who will bring a backpack to an interview, and you're a professional at this point, so you need to have something more like a small valise, which is pretty cheap. You can get them at H&M, you can get them at an office supply store for 30 or 40 bucks, but it's a nice little investment. Definitely bring a pen and paper. You want to be able to write as you are in the interview scenario, either write questions down or to take notes. It's a good way to make sure that you look engaged and that you're actually interested in what the interviewer is saying. It's also, in some cases, there are super complex questions, and it's great to just kind of jot down the most important points. And the last is excitement, which is a little bit of a fudge, obviously, but you want to be the kind of candidate who understands what the firm does and is thrilled to be there, is just excited to meet the people who could potentially be working with you, and that you want to be able to express excitement about the mission or the organization. It's really important. When we're nervous, we get very self-focused, and it's difficult to get outside ourselves and try to remember why we want a particular position. But it's really important to convey that excitement, and by conveying your enthusiasm about a given position, you can actually get over some of the nervousness that is inherent in conducting an interview. Look the part, for sure. It's what we say than underdressed, regardless of what kind of firm you're interviewing with, although it's also always acceptable to ask the hiring manager or the HR representative you're talking to about what attire would be appropriate. I'm not the world's leading fashion expert. We have some general tips here at UChicagoGRAD for both women and men when it comes to interviewing. For both women and men, a gray or dark tan suit or sometimes navy blue can be acceptable. Try to keep it, guys should keep it simple when it comes to the shirt. A simple white or blue shirt can work, but a tie that has a little bit of a pop of color, and similarly for women, a blouse that has a little color in it is totally acceptable. For women, go easy on jewelry, something simple. It's the old Emily Post rule to take one piece of jewelry off before you leave the house. That goes for men too. One accessory should be off before you leave the house. For women, pants versus skirt, we've talked to a lot of recruiters about interview etiquette, and it really is what you're comfortable with. Same goes for heels or no heels, but one thing is we talk to a lot of advisees who say, I'm going to get a pair of heels. Well, make sure that if you don't wear heels typically, that you don't make the interview the first time that you ever put on a pair of heels. It's important to wear the shoes that you're going to be wearing at some point before the interview. This goes for men too. You know how stiff those Cole Haans can be when you first put them on after buying them at the store. The only other additional things I'd say about guys is clean up the facial hair for sure. I really prefer to advise that guys go, shave as closely as they can. If you keep a beard, make sure that it is cropped. And the two best items that men can buy is leather shoes and a new belt. They'll make you feel shiny and new, and they're also quite noticeable in the interview setting. If you buy a new shirt or a new blouse if you're a lady, and it comes in the plastic packaging, make sure that you don't take it out the morning of the interview and it leaves in the factory-made or the factory-induced wrinkles. I've seen a lot of graduate students at events with shirts that they've clearly opened that morning. Make sure you get pressed by a dry cleaner before you head off to an interview. We get a lot of questions about how much you should be investing in interview attire, and for us it's really a question of your fit, not how much money you spend. It's a question about getting a good haircut. It's a question about not wearing a backpack. It's a question about investing in tailoring and getting a nicer suit than trying to think that you need 5 different suits for 5 different kinds of interviews. So make an investment in yourself in a couple of nice items that you can use for many years and get it tailored so that it actually fits your body. We definitely suggest that you wear it all first and ask for honesty from a family member, from a close friend, and from whomever you're practicing your interview with to make sure that it looks like an appropriate outfit. Remember that practice makes perfect, and this is something that I cannot emphasize enough. How do we suggest that you practice? Well, first thing is when it comes to pacing and construction of answers, you should rehearse and even maybe type out at first your answers to a selection of common interview questions. But you shouldn't necessarily memorize the answers to those questions. You can record yourself reading the script a couple of times, and to make a confession, on Monday, actually, I had a lot of my remarks typed out and would just kind of ad-lib while you all were listening. But you need to get to a place where you feel fluid, where you feel confident in that what you know you're going to say, but that you're not just reading off of a script. It can be helpful in this case to think of the 3 main points that you're trying to make in an answer to a potential question, and make sure that you're hitting those 3 talking points on the way towards answering. Slow down no matter what. I've talked about this a little bit, but it's important that you take your time with answers to questions and also are clearly articulating and clearly explaining what your response is going to be. You should practice different approaches to questions, so you shouldn't have to prepare for every single question in the known universe. Rather, you should use, let's say, a story about a strength or a story about a time that you solved a problem on a team. And think about how you can use those answers to address different kinds of questions. So, for example, an answer about solving a problem on a team can also address a challenge in the workplace. So if an interviewer asks you, tell me about a time you had a challenge in the workplace, you can actually say the same story that you would have for a strength. You should try to have 2 different narratives for a couple of different questions so you have some material to draw on. Throughout all of your practice, you should try to produce positive accounts of your work experience, your academic experience, your experience at the University of Chicago. This goes even for, we got a couple of questions about what happens if your last job ended in termination. You don't want to be the candidate who walks away from a previous opportunity and expresses bitterness, because remember, this is your first impression with a wholly new set of people who are interested in hearing about who you are right now, not the person you necessarily were at the end of your previous job. So it's important that you say good things about your previous experience, even in challenging situations. In fact, your ability to talk about a really challenging work environment that precedes your current situation can be a real asset. You want to portray yourself as someone who can work through challenges and who can find productive solutions and be amicable even when things don't work out. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about etiquette, and we get a lot of questions about different cultural contexts, so I want to just be specific here that a couple of the things that I'll say about etiquette are really specific to American and North American context. Eye contact should be direct, especially during your handshake with the interviewer and during questions. I find it's good to at least start, when an interviewer starts asking a question, it's good to look up and acknowledge that they are asking the question. You can go to make notes after that, but it's important that you acknowledge that a question is coming your way. At the same time, beware of the stare. So don't feel like you should be compelled to stare directly into the soul of your interviewer. This is something you can really work through when you're practicing with a pal. Remember that age does not indicate rank in many organizations. So just because you're interviewing with someone who looks like they're in their 20s or early 30s does not mean that person isn't a vice president or director of a large project or even someone who's in charge of a company. And this goes both ways. We got a lot of questions about concerns related to the candidate's age when they enter the room, I think that age can be a real asset in an interview scenario, especially if you're able to come up with answers that talk about experience and facility with lots of different kinds of work. Age can, we got one question about what happens when an interviewer expresses surprise at your age. And again, one of these illegal questions is they're not actually allowed to ask you your age in an interview setting. I think that you can always go with answers that talk about your experience, the breadth of your experience, but also the depth. So I think that job candidates who are changing careers or who are trying to make a move into a senior position from potentially another senior position get themselves into trouble because their answers are far longer. You're anxious about trying to convey experience, but in that context you'll often forget about needing to articulate fitness in a concise and precise way to fit this particular opportunity. Don't fear small talk, and I think this is another thing that you should practice. You could talk about the weather, talk about sports, about the Bears, kind of know what's going on in local politics, although politics will typically be off the table. When it comes to politics, you should be as agnostic about your politics as possible, unless you're potentially interviewing at an advocacy organization that has specific political leanings. But don't be afraid that small talk is not the interview or that it feels secondary. In fact, small talk can be extremely important because it's demonstrating your ability to just be a colleague, to just kind of hang out. Remember that interviewers are often looking for someone who they can hire who will fit into the team and that will be able to go out to lunch with everybody, that will be able to have small talk around the water cooler. So this isn't something that should distract you or you should be worried about because the real questions are being delayed. Enjoy the conversation with a person and get to know them a little bit more. In most cases, it's good to follow the interviewer's lead. So I think it's important for you to come in with an agenda so that in case the interviewer says, you know, how do you want to conduct this conversation, which is sometimes, especially with more senior interviewers, they might just want to get to know you a little bit more. So you should have a roadmap for how how you want the scenario to unfold, how you want the interview to go. But you should also feel comfortable following the interviewer's lead when it comes to small talk, when it comes to questions, when it comes to the kinds of responses that you're being asked to provide. Okay, what about in the room itself? What can you expect and how can you prepare to make effective answers? We think there are a couple of really good elements of strong answers. First of all, brevity. This is a big problem for all of us who have spent any 2 sentences is always better than 3. You want to be clipped, you want to be short, and you want to be efficient. Remember that as a conversation, you need to leave the interviewer the space necessary to actually engage with you. Don't answer questions that aren't being asked. So if you're asked to talk about your strengths, you don't necessarily want to talk about your strengths and then go right into talking about weaknesses. It's important to answer the questions that are being asked. I'll say that again. And that is a skill too. You have to actually listen to the question and try to understand the interviewer's motivation for why they're asking it. When you hear the question, it can be good to try to articulate to the interviewer what you think the stakes of the questions might be. So in other words, an interviewer might ask you, tell me about a time that you had to work with a new colleague and train them on a new skill or a new platform or a new set of methods. Your answer to that kind of question can begin by saying, you know, that's interesting. I think that that's really important because in this capacity, given the job that I'm applying for, I know that I'll probably be working with a lot of younger trainees who potentially don't have the content area specialty yet. And so I think it's important that we talk a little bit about my approach to teaching and my approach to training. This acknowledges the value of the interviewer's question and says that you've listened to them and you've acknowledged some way that it might be important. It also cues to the interviewer how you are interpreting a question. And if your understanding of why a question is important is not aligned with the interviewers, then they might step in and say, actually, I'm interested in this question from a different perspective. And that can help you decide exactly how you should be answering the question. Addressing multiple viewpoints is something that UChicago students and alumni do very well. So you're able to get around an entire problem. So in case you're worried about your particular viewpoint on a specific question, you can say, well, one way I can think about answering this question is this, and provide your answer. And then say, but I'm also able to see the opposite side and think through the answer to this question this way. What does this do? First of all, it gives the interviewer a chance to decide which method they prefer, and it also shows that you have the capacity to understand problems from multiple sides. As I've said already, make sure that you remain positive and focused on strengths. You want to produce narrative examples that produced results. So talk always about what you did in the context of how what you did produced something tangibly beneficial for your previous company, organization, or even in the context of academic work. Try to avoid apologizing. This happens a ton for graduate students and postdocs that we've dealt with here at UChicagoGRAD. You don't want to start a question by saying, well, I don't actually have precisely the skill that you're looking for, but I do have this instead. This is always motivated by a good thing. It's motivated by a desire to be honest, right? But what the interviewer is hearing is, I don't have the thing that you need. What you should be talking about instead is, I hear you needing this, and here's the way that what I've done in the past I think fits pretty well into what you're asking for. As I talked about on Monday and as Joe talked about yesterday, you want to try to articulate what your skills and experience are in the idiom of the interview itself. Here are a couple of ways to indicate your confidence and some potential ways to slow down and give yourself time to think during an interview that's gotten a little stressful. You can rephrase a question to clarify. So this is something that I love that we're in a presidential debate year. You can see politicians do all of this stuff all of the time. You'll try to say, what I hear you asking is this, and you'll present the question. And the interviewer can then either clarify, yes, that is exactly what the question is, or they can say, actually, I'm trying to ask this. There's some people who's, it's not everybody's job that they're doing interviews all the time, so some people really just aren't good at it. And you're helping them be a better interviewer, and you're keeping them in the conversation by asking them to be super specific about what they are trying to get from you. This shows that you're trying to get the right answer, and you're not jumping to conclusions about what they want to hear right away, which is a good skill to have for the workplace. Tying answers to previous questions or comments, as I said at the outset, is a great way to demonstrate that you're understanding the interview as a conversation and not as an interrogation. So your ability to draw threads through the interview will help cement certain of your strengths because you are repeating certain kinds of answers, or at least showing that you're the kind of person who can connect seemingly disparate responses to make one solid claim about your qualifications or skills. Keep in mind that you can always take a moment to think about an answer. You can always say, that's a really good question. Let me think about that. I want to kind of address one of the questions we got beforehand here. So we got a question that asked, suggesting ideas for preparing to demonstrate how I can do the work or solve the problems of the organization that I'm interviewing. This is a complicated kind of question, and it requires some thought. And what you want to convey to the interviewer is that you're actually engaged and interested in putting together a logical, methodical, and thorough answer to their question. So you can definitely take a moment to think, and if you have a pen and paper, which hopefully you will, because that's part of your preparation, you can jot down a few notes first. I'd much rather interview a candidate who wants to be thoughtful about their response than jump in without having a clear thought in mind. The final thing is keep the interviewer engaged. So when we're nervous, like I said before, we tend to close down. We tend to think only about ourselves and how we are projecting ourselves. It's important to make sure that you're responding to the interviewer, that you understand and read their expressions, and that you do things like stop your answer and say, I'm going to stop there because I think that answered the question, but I'd love to hear if you want me to say more, I'm happy to continue. It's a great way to shorten the question, be attentive to an interviewer that maybe is starting to look a little distracted, and make sure that you are attentive to where they actually want you to go. Okay, what about appearances? These are extremely important. The thing that will help you win in the first 20 seconds, right, so that 80% of what an interviewer thinks about you is determined in the first 20 seconds. You want to bring a smile and energy into the room immediately. You want to walk into a room with your hand out, ready to be shaken, and you want to keep your eyes up. And we get a lot of questions about this. So where should your eyes be? Well, they should be right there at the bridge of the nose. That is the professional zone. We all tend, as we get more informal, as we get to know people a little more, we size each other up a little bit more. Our eyes tend to move down the face. Actually, you'll notice that when you talk to your friends, you're actually always kind of trying to read their facial expressions below the nose. You want to keep in an interview, it's good to just stare right at the bridge of the nose when you have to make contact and keep your eyes level. At your side with minimal gestures. If you're someone who gestures a lot, I don't want you to feel like you have to tie your hands behind your back, but just keep an eye on how you use your hands. This is especially useful when to think about when you are practicing in front of a mirror. Gestures can definitely help pull words out. There's actually social science research that suggests that gestures really augment language and help us find words that are somewhere out there that we can't grab onto. But it can be extremely distracting to have someone who's gesturing too much, and you want to be excited but not frantic. Your feet should be flat. We get a lot of questions about crossed legs. If you're going to cross legs, they can definitely be crossed at the knee as opposed to at the ankle, but feet flat is the best way to go, and definitely sitting up nice and straight. Let's talk about some common questions. Some of these are tricky, so tell us about yourself. What are your 3 weaknesses and strengths? Tell us about a time that you worked on a team, and give positive accounts of your department or experience, or tell us about where you were before here. I suggest that you start with these and work your way into some of the trickier ones, like what are your salary requirements? So we got a lot of questions about salary questions, and I wanted to say a brief thing about salary conversations. The rule of thumb here is he or she who says a specific number first typically loses. A great response to what are your salary requirements, especially early in a process, is something to the effect of, well, you know, salary is just one measure of how I would like to evaluate the offer. Should I move through the process? I know that you all offer some great benefits, and I like to think about offers in total. Sorry, I'm fudging this a little bit, but essentially what you want to do is try to delay providing a specific number until the hiring manager puts one in front of you. At that point, you can say, okay, well, considering the number and considering what the responsibilities of the position are, I think that might be reasonable. Just so that you know, I was thinking and hoping that given my experience and qualifications, it might be slightly higher to this number. But I'm certainly open to continuing the conversation. You shouldn't have to get into the nitty-gritty conversation of negotiation until the final stages of accepting the offer. You should have answers to questions about long-term goals too. So questions about career objectives can be really important because firms want to know that you're going to stay. They want to know that you're not a flight risk. So you should have a pretty clear articulation of how this particular position fits into your overall objectives. This last one is a real tricky one for those with graduate degrees, and it's a real trap. So answering the question, why are you leaving academia? This is where many of our advisees often start talking about how the academic job market is just horrible, and they're looking for something like an alternative or looking for a good second chance. And the person who's interviewing you, it might not have been their alternative career. It might not have been their second chance. What you should be describing here is precisely how your academic career has led you precisely to this. It's incredibly logical to take your research experience and your education into this new and different setting. Remember that some questions are illegal. Your nationality, though firms can ask about your work authorization, your marital status, anything about disabilities or sexual orientation. Understand that some of these questions get asked informally, so an interviewer might ask you, do you have kids? And that's actually not something that you are required to answer. It's actually something they're not supposed to be asking. But understand that they might be trying to get to know you. So if you're worried about the answer to any of these questions, try to understand that their motivation is to either get to know you or to try to identify reasons why you might not be able to take the position were it to be offered to you. We did get a question about birth dates, and if it is, and specifically in the context of being needed for a background check, I will actually have to get back. I haven't seen that as a potential deal breaker for interviews, but I can definitely do a little research. As far as as I understand, asking about your age in the context of an interview should not be something that's inbounds. A couple of final things here about the most common fears and the most common concerns that we see among our constituencies is that all I have is grad school. I don't have any other kind of experience. And that might go for some of you too. You only have one type of experience. Well, if you are coming from, let's say, University of Chicago, a PhD in the anthropology department like Dr. Jones, what you actually have is the ability to conduct research, to teach, and to write. So conducting research is really about making a plan, collecting evidence and conducting the research necessary to wed that evidence to a kind of claim. You might, at some point during your research, reach a stalemate, or you might be getting bad outcomes, and this is great interview fodder for a time when you have tried to confront a challenge. Maybe you've had to change your career, maybe you've had to change your research question. Remember that really tough moments in your career, academic or otherwise, can be really good source material for strong questions about how you respond to adversity. And definitely if you've had an advising relationship, having a relationship with a demanding team of managers can be really good as well. So you want to talk about how you've negotiated difficult advising or management situations. If you've taught, then that means that you have had experience managing demanding clients, that you have to meet their expectations. So you have to email students real late at night. You have to make sure that you have office hours. You have to deal with folks who potentially maybe are dealing with emotional issues or psychological issues in the context of your work. If you've taught, that means that you know how to assess and address diverse needs of multiple kinds of stakeholders, learners coming to a situation with all different levels of ability. It means that you have the improvisational skills necessary to stand in front of an audience and the flexibility in changing circumstances as classroom scenarios are always widely varied. And it means you have the ability to present complex ideas to an audience of beginners. You take really complicated thought about a given topic area and you communicate it to folks who are much younger than you are and who are less experienced. Equally important is writing. So this proves that you're a self-directed worker if you've completed a long thesis, doctoral dissertation, or otherwise long project. You know how to take and receive criticism. This is extremely important in the workplace. You need to know how to respond to colleagues and how to make sure that your work is improved by their feedback. And also potentially you present and publish your work. Finally, the most commonly overlooked task is to make sure that you have good questions as well. So there are three specific reasons why this is important. It's to demonstrate that you've done your homework, demonstrate that you're curious and ready to contribute to a position, and then it gives you an opportunity to frame your question. So asking about a typical day won't cut it, and certainly saying, I don't have any other questions, thank you for your time, will not be something that's going to serve your advantage. You should avoid asking questions for which the answer is basically, let me Google that, or basically information about how many employees the company has. In this way, also, yes-no questions are less effective than those that ask for detail. Instead, you should ask questions that you're actually interested in the answers to, questions that you couldn't find when researching the website. Asking about the interviewer's own career path and history can be a real way to connect with them and make sure that the interview is sounding like a conversation. People also love to talk about themselves, so they'll leave with a positive impression of you if what they get from your final questions is the opportunity to share why they're passionate or excited about what they're doing now. Asking what the most effective employees do before starting shows that you're curious about what skills you can develop to make sure that you're a good fit for the organization. It can also give you the opportunity to understand better if you have the kinds of qualities that employees who already work there have. And I always suggest that you can ask what you left unanswered. In other words, you can ask, is there anything else that you'd like me to say that you haven't, or any concerns that you have that I can address now? Sometimes an interviewer will say, you know, I want to go back to that one question that you answered and kind of dig in a little bit more. This gives you a chance to get any bugs out, anything that you might leave the room otherwise thinking the interview went really well, but the interviewer might have a sticking question that he has about you. This is a great chance to clear the air before you leave the room. When framing your question, it's important to say something about yourself before asking. So for example, instead of asking, what is a typical day, and you wouldn't ask that anyway. But you could say, you know, in my current role, my typical day takes me from A to B to C. Sometimes I'm working with clients, and sometimes I'm working directly in teams with colleagues. So I'm curious, what does your typical day look like? Or what does maybe an atypical day look like in firm X? Now you're giving the interviewer some context for the question. You're helping them understand why you're asking. And that you're also saying something about yourself that you might not have had a chance to say previously in any of the answers to the questions. Okay, so you've got all of this prep under your belt, and I hope that you'll continue to ask questions. In terms of follow-up, a brief thank you email to the interviewers is appropriate for a phone or Skype call. When you have multiple round on-site interviews, make sure that you're sending a thank you note both to the HR representative for logistics help and then also individual emails to each person with whom you talked. It's important to make sure that you're getting contact information from everyone you talk to. You can also, in the follow-up, send specific links or resources that you think might be interesting based on the content of your conversation and indicate that you'd love to keep the conversation moving forward. Be certain to ask for a timeline on the decision and make sure that you understand when you should be hearing so that you don't have to follow up continuously. We typically recommend that it's about 10 days before you should be thinking about following up. That is after the interview. Here are some of our resources and some ideas about how you can get started. I'll send around a couple of others. There were questions about online resources for interview questions, and I'll share some of our own resources with common interview questions with Ali. I'm going to scroll through a couple of the other questions that we've gotten. Here's a great one about family. So I took 4 years off from working due to having and caring for my daughter. How do I address this when the interviewer asks about a time lapse? A related question is, how do I present this as a positive rather than a negative situation? So in the context of answering this question, it's important to try to talk a little bit about what you might have done on the side as well. So if you've maintained any kind of interest in volunteering and travel, in being invested in your kid's life, that can be seen as a positive. I think there's a knee-jerk that this is always a negative, and it just might not be the case. Again, they shouldn't be asking you about your marital status or about your kids, but if you do have a gap on your resume or CV that you think is going to raise eyebrows, I think it is best to talk about this in as positive a light as possible and to say that the moment when you took a pause in your career was the perfect moment to take a break because you had reached a certain point where it just made sense, right? You achieved a couple of very specific goals, and from there it looked like it might be time to start a family. But you should also, if this does come up, if it does become something that you're talking about, then you can talk about how you've maintained interest in certain industries, how you've remained engaged in the kind of industry, organization, firm, nonprofit, in the issue areas that matter to the company that you're interviewing with, and then move quickly back to, I'm super excited to get back into the workforce now, and I would love to keep talking about how my experience and skills are a good fit for this organization. So you should try to move pretty quickly, but again, the important thing is to be as positive as possible in articulating why you took a break. I am looking through some of the final questions that I might not have gotten to. An interesting question that we get, it's often something that folks are fearful of, is a confrontational interviewer who the question is that they seem like they're just looking over the goods and they're not actually engaged. So should I drop being polite and aim for intimidation instead? I think the answer is no, because you don't necessarily know whether an interviewer is playing a role, trying to figure out if you can handle a difficult client, trying to see if you can get stressed but still manage. I think it's always appropriate to say, that's a little bit of a forceful question, and it's not something I anticipated having to answer. It's a great place to pause, take the air out of the room a little bit, and just say, is what you're asking this? Clarify X, Y, or Z. If you're in a really terrible interview situation, and I promise you this does not happen too often in our experience, you can absolutely take that as a sign that this might not be the organization for you. As I said at the outset, you are interviewing the organization almost as much as they are interviewing you, and it's important that you feel like you have the power to say, you know what, this conversation is not what I expected it was going to be. I'm not getting a good vibe here, and that's totally okay. And I think it's better that you learn that in the interview scenario rather than, once you've accepted an offer. So I think I've gotten through most of the questions and we're at exactly 1 p.m. So for now, I will say thanks again for all of you who attended. It's been great to present so far this week. Join us tomorrow. Mike Tesla will be presenting on networking, and then on Friday we'll have Emily for negotiation. Thanks so much again.
Hi, this is Allie Schultz again. I want to reiterate AJ's thanks to everyone for joining the presentation, and we also want to thank AJ for walking us through the steps to a successful interview. Do watch your email for a link to a recording of today's presentation along with a follow-up survey. That should be going out early next week. And you're also invited to join us online at careers.uchicagoalumni.org, where you will find upcoming events, links to our past webinars, and our alumni jobs board. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at tomorrow's webinar.